Welcome to Better Sex, where you get the information and inspiration to create and enjoy your best possible sex life. Join your host, sex therapist Jessa Zimmerman, as she brings you expert guests, helpful tips, knowledge, and strategies to improve your intimate relationships. And now, your host, Jessa Zimmerman.
Hey everybody, it's Jessa back for another episode of the Better Sex Podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in and being with me today. I so appreciate all of you who are out there listening and supporting the show. I do want to let you know that I use Patreon as a way to get support, financial support for the show. It's kind of like an NPR pledge. You go on and you make a small monthly pledge that just gets billed to your card once a month and allows me to keep the show going. And I just added a new level of $20 a month, which gets you a free copy of my book, Sex Without Stress, to start out, and would make a huge difference to my ability to keep on doing this. So if you are not a supporter yet, I invite you to check out Patreon. I've got a link on my podcast website, bettersexpodcast.com, that you can follow and see. And every level of support gives you advance access to every episode. So you get an email, an alert a few days before the release with the recording of every show. So I would love to have you join me in that. Each week, I'm trying to bring you interesting topics that can make a difference in your sex life. And I know that some are more relevant to you than others. You maybe don't listen to every single show because certain of them, really have nothing to do with your situation. And this is probably going to be another one of those. But I think this topic is really interesting. So even if it's not something that you're exploring or thinking about exploring, it might be worth your time to listen through and learn a little bit and just have the knowledge, because it's kind of fascinating. The topic today is BDSM. And I know some of you are practitioners of BDSM. This is a big part of your sex life. Cool. Other people maybe have heard the term and are a little confused about what it means. And maybe for some of the rest of you, this is a whole new concept. But BDSM, which stands for, bondage, dominance, sadism, and masochism. There we go. Off the top of my head, those are the four letters. It's a subset of what's considered kinky, right? It's about power play, and it's about pain, and it's about exploring some of the edges of sexuality. And I talked today to Tamara Pincus, who is an AASECT certified sex therapist, as am I, but who is really a specialist in Kink, BDSM, and polyamory as well in her practice in DC. So she was a great person to have come on the show and just start off with what is BDSM, how do people do it successfully, how might you start if you're interested, and how do you talk to your partner about it if this is something brand new. I hope you enjoyed the show. Tamara, thank you so much for being with me today.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here.
Yeah, this will be, I think, an enlightening topic for people. Some people are familiar with BDSM. Some people have just heard about it, and probably it's brand new for other listeners. So yeah. I look for this to be a really educational episode.
Yeah, I hope it will be really helpful for people.
Yeah.
Stop me if I seem to go too far, because I'm in a world where this is I mostly talk to people for whom this is really normal everyday stuff. So sometimes I won't define my terms, or I'll talk ahead of things. So
right. I'll try.
Stop me.
Yeah, I think this probably is. Yeah, and we're trying to cover the bases, right? People where this is brand new, and then people that maybe are more familiar and have questions. So it's a tall order today. Why don't we just start with what is BDSM? What do the letters stand for, and then what's sort of a definition for it?
So BDSM stands for bondage, domination, and sadomasochism.
Okay.
So tying people up, one person having power over another, sometimes using pain as a way of intensifying the connection or the sensation of the experience. And I think there's a lot of things that can fall under there. I think there are things that a lot of people have done that seem pretty routine for a lot of people, like spanking. I also think that though we don't tend to think of sort of the run-of-the-mill sex as being BDSM, but I think a lot of people characterize the way they talk about just plain intercourse as a very sort of like the man is doing something to the woman in a way that's sort of dominant. So we think of it as this like really out there thing, but I think as a culture, we definitely assume a certain power dynamic in the way run-of-the-mill heterosexual sex happens. So
okay, so you're basically saying there's sort of a continuum of these things, right? Flavors or ways that maybe more of us are playing in some of that energy, and we don't even think of it as BDSM. We think of BDSM as like the extreme end of the spectrum or something like that.
Right. But I think whenever you have one person holding dominance over another, you're really engaging with BDSM in a way. And I think it's important when we're doing that to be conscious of the fact that there's a power dynamic in play and to make sure that that's a power dynamic that we're choosing, as opposed to we just do it that way because that's the way it's done.
Okay. Interesting. So I guess you're talking about consensual play, right? Like that even in our regular sex, we want to be thinking about, is this what we're choosing? Is this what we're enjoying?
Right. Right. But I also think being aware that like the way we talk about like heterosexual intercourse is usually as a male dominant way of looking at it. Like this is a thing that a man does to a woman, which is fundamentally sort of using a power dynamic in a way that like if it were something that we were looking at as like we're equally doing something to each other and the woman is enveloping the man as much as the man is entering the woman, that like that's not how actually we usually conceptualize it.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sitting here thinking, I mean, I probably have had experiences across that whole spectrum. Like I'm imagining listeners thinking, wait a minute, we're having sex that isn't so dominant or role specific. So, I mean, I guess what I'm saying is heterosexual sex, the way we talk about it, I think reflects that power dynamic in general. But the way we experience it may or may not.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay. Yes. And what's the difference? I mean, is there a difference between BDSM and kink? Are those interchangeable?
So I think kink is a much wider definition. And I think there are kinks that really like wouldn't fall under BDSM, like splooshing, for instance. Like if you're into, I don't know, sitting on cakes, like it's kinky, but it's not necessarily BDSM.
Okay. So BDSM is one segment of what's considered kinky.
Right. It's sort of a flavor of kink.
Okay. And I know that, I mean, in some ways there are definitions to these terms, and in other ways this is stuff evolving and it's hard to categorize. I'm just thinking about the listeners and trying to help them out with some basic understanding here. So
right. Yeah.
Could you say, is there anything else you'd want to say about the kinds of behaviors that fall under BDSM?
I mean, I think that a lot of different types of role play can fall under BDSM. Definitely the sort of master-slave stuff, which is also really controversial, or like there's definitely a lot of different kinds of ways of playing with pain, like flogging and spanking and all of those things. There's just a lot that can fall under there.
Right. Okay. So again, a lot of these questions I'm asking is not because I have them personally, but
because you figure people have them.
Trying to think of the listeners and think, what would they want to know? And so one of the sort of sets of questions that I have that I'm sure some people are thinking is this normal? Is it healthy? Are people doing something wrong? And especially, are they acting out their own trauma?
So that's a lot of questions.
I know. So feel free to take them.
Is it normal? Yes, it's normal. I mean, I think I can't remember all the places where all the studies that I've looked at that I can't necessarily remember who said what. But I think there's something like definitely over 70% of people are at least fantasizing about this kind of stuff.
Okay.
So even if people aren't necessarily all acting on it, a majority of people have some fantasies that involve these things. So it's very normal. And I don't think I don't think we should categorize it as a problem unless there's consent being violated or any kind of harm being done.
Okay.
So I think otherwise there's not really any problem with it.
Okay.
There's not necessarily a higher prevalence of people with trauma histories in the BDSM community. I think that different people deal with their trauma in different ways. So some people actually get something out of working through their trauma in a kink context. So if you look at some of the work that Samantha Manowitz has done, Like she talks about people who are really reclaiming some of their power by working through some of the trauma stuff with kink. And it actually, like, if you look at things like EMDR, they sort of work sort of similarly. Like you're doing something physical to like address the feelings about the trauma. And I think that if we look at whether or not this is problematic as far as like a trauma sense, I think that that's really about whether it's conscious. Like, so some people replay their trauma in an unconscious way. Like they have had an experience of trauma and then they go out and that experience happens over and over again. They're not necessarily feeling like they're choosing it, but sometimes they will go to places where the same things happen. And they feel bad about it. Like it feels crappy every time.
Okay.
And then some people who will deliberately recreate a situation that mirrors their trauma, but they will make choices about how to make it safe for them and they feel better afterwards. Like for me, if somebody feels healed after they do something that recreates their trauma, then they're on the right path.
Okay. So it's largely dictated by their own internal response after, right? Do they feel lousy or do they feel more empowered?
Right. And do they feel like they chose this?
Yeah. Okay. So there's sort of an intentional healing path through this. I mean, it's sort of the concept I think we use of going back and mastering the experience or demonstrating that power and choice. And they can reclaim that in some ways.
Right. And some people do that by like being in sort of in the same position. So if something happened to them, they recreate something happened to them. And some people take the sort of opposite role. So if something happened to them, then they take the role of being in control and doing something to somebody else with consent of everybody involved. And sometimes that can also be a very empowering situation for people.
Okay. All right. But you're also saying there's no correlation exactly with trauma in this BDSM choice or lifestyle or desire, right? Plenty of people without trauma are also enjoying these sexual acts.
Right. Well, if you can find plenty of people without trauma, like,
yeah, that's true.
I mean, if you look at like how much trauma is happening in our culture,
yeah,
like, and if you're inclusive of the different kinds of trauma, like including sexual harassment and street harassment, like the majority of people have had some kind of trauma.
Well, that's true.
But true.
But not necessarily driving their kinds of sexual choices.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So talk to me a little bit about how do people, I mean, you talked about consent, and how do people do this safely? Like, what are the tips for acting on BDSM with a willing partner? Are there steps to this or what needs to be considered?
So I think you really want to be very careful about talking about what you're going to do before you do it and making sure that everybody consents to the things that you're going to do, having safe words or ways for the things or safe signals or whatever you need to demonstrate that you're no longer consenting if that happens. I think it's important for people to really be attuned to each other, because one of the things that happens that we don't talk about is that people can also dissociate during sexual experiences and during kink experiences. So sometimes you're not able to safe word or you're not able to say, this isn't okay, but you don't feel okay. So you want to make sure that the top is paying attention to what the signals are, making eye contact, and really being aware of what the emotional state of the submissive person is. And I think that also you want to get some training in what you're doing. Like,
oh, okay.
Well, because if you're going to do rope bondage and you don't know what you're doing, you can cut off circulation. You can really injure people. Somebody in my family, who I won't name, had experiences of going and getting rope bondage done and passing out.
Wow.
While being suspended. And like, you don't want that to happen.
Right.
Like, you want people to be aware of like, where are the places where you can cut off circulation that can cause that kind of thing. And also people need to be aware of their health conditions, like if there's something that's going to make them pass out, to like know that sort of thing. And also if you're going to play with things that are more extreme, like breath play, don't do breath play without getting any training.
Wow. Okay.
Die.
This makes me sound like, before you pick up an exercise program, you're supposed to get permission from your doctor. I mean, is this, do you sort of advise that people even get an okay from a physician before certain types of play?
I mean, I'm not sure there's a physician that you could ask.
I was going to say, this must blow their minds largely.
Yeah. I mean, looking for kink-friendly physicians, there's the Kink Aware Professionals list, but I just don't think there's enough on there. But I think if you like paying attention, like, do you have a circulation problem? Do you have low blood pressure? Like, what are the things? And being able to voice that.
Okay.
And I mean, I guess I'm sort of old school in that, like, when I was first entering the kink community, because I've been in the kink community for over 20 years. Yes, I'm not old. Like, you would go to a class, like an actual in-person class on how to do bondage, and I think a lot of people are doing that kind of stuff now by like watching YouTube videos or watching porn. And porn is not sex education.
Okay, so even with kink, you should not be learning this from porn.
I don't think so.
Okay.
I mean, there are some good books out there on how to do things, and in DC, there's a local dungeon that has like a Dungeon 101 night where they have little stations and you can walk around and somebody will teach you how to do the things. And I would hope that, like, if you're in a city with a dungeon, like, definitely go to those things. Like, talk to a person in person about how you do this safely.
Right. In Seattle, we had a place, although I think they lost their lease. I don't know if they're back open, but they did a lot of classes in various kink and BDSM things. How, I mean, okay, now I've got all these different questions about what you've said. So, but let me start with this one. How does somebody even find a dungeon? Like, if somebody's in Atlanta or Houston or some big city, how do you find the places that might have the classes in these things?
Fetlife.com.
Okay. Fetlife.com. All right, let's put that link in the show notes too.
Yeah, it's like kinky Facebook, but people don't use their real names, and a lot of them don't use their real pictures, which I think makes sense.
Okay.
And you can find all kinds of local events and local dungeons and all that kind of stuff on there. It's weird because it's also, I mean, I guess for me, I'm the least visual person ever. So like having my kinky events mixed up with like actual porn is sort of like, this feels weird, but but it's there.
Yeah.
You got your commercials for porn in the corner.
Right.
But it works. You can find the things. And a lot of stuff is a lot harder to find online than it used to be because of FOSTA-SESTA. Like people that could put information out there are having a much harder time doing that. So that's something to keep in mind. Okay.
Would you say fetlife.com is a decent source for information and community around BDSM?
I would say, I mean, I would trust it as far as like, these are the events that are happening. Like, I don't think they have forums on pretty much everything, but I don't think those forums are well moderated. So I wouldn't necessarily trust the advice of like whoever the hell goes on there and tells you what to do. Like, don't trust all those people.
Okay. All right. And then, and YouTube, is it the same kind of thing? Like some of these videos are really good and well done and others are less responsible?
I'm sure that's true. I haven't watched a lot of the stuff on YouTube because I've been doing this stuff in the community for so long. Like I don't watch a lot of the educational videos these days.
Right. Okay. It's Jessa. I'm just taking a quick break in the middle of the show to let you know about some guides I have available to you if you're interested. So desire discrepancy is the phenomenon where one person wants more sex than the other, and it's actually universal. This is always true, at least over time in a relationship. So nothing is broken if you have desire discrepancy, and yet it is so easy to get caught in dynamics that are really, really difficult when this is happening. You fall into what I call the traps of desire discrepancy, and then you end up at odds with each other and almost polarized and not navigating this difference in a way that works for both of you. So I have written up guides, one for the lower desire partner and one for the higher desire partner, about what these traps are and what you might do differently. So if you would like to download these, they are totally free. You can go to bettersexpodcast.com/desire and download them. I hope they help. Back to the show. All right, so back to the first point you were making about discussing what's going to happen in a sexual encounter. I mean, can you say a little bit more about that? Like, in what kind of detail is it? Are these things like totally scripted, or is any room for spontaneity?
I think it's important not to totally script it. I think when you totally script it, it sort of kills the thing.
Okay.
But I think it makes sense to have a sense of like, what are the activities that are okay and what activities are not okay.
Okay.
And you can actually find online these things called yes, no, maybe lists.
Okay.
We'll have a list of different kinds of activities, and you can say, yes, I would do that. No, I wouldn't do that. That one's a maybe, we would have to negotiate more.
Okay.
So if you have that kind of list, then you can go in knowing this person is open to flogging and spanking, but not caning, or, this person is open to rope bondage, but doesn't necessarily want to be gagged, like whatever
Okay.
the things are.
Okay. Do you happen to, do you have a yes, no, maybe list that we could link to in the show notes too? Or
I mean, I looked some up last week, so I can send those to you later.
yeah. I mean, yeah. If you've got them, that might be an interesting thing to include, at least an example of that. So
yeah, I mean, and there's different ones. Some of them are more vanilla. Some of them are really very kinky. Some of them are long. Some of them are short.
Right. Okay. And then you said a safe word or safe signal.
Right. So if you're gagged, you can't safe word because you can't make words. So oftentimes they'll have something like a ball in your hand, where if you drop the ball, then that means that you're no longer okay with what's going on.
Okay. And I suppose at the use of one of those things, everything sort of stops and you check in?
Well, so some people traditionally, yes, but oftentimes people would use like red, yellow, and green. And for yellow, you just sort of slow down and check in with the person. You don't necessarily stop the whole scene.
Okay.
And sometimes, and I think it's important to have that, because sometimes people will be liking things generally, but also your elbows on my hair,
Right.
like you just need a little bit of adjustment. You don't necessarily need the whole scene to stop.
Okay.
And sometimes the only kind of thing you have is the whole scene stops and, your elbow's on my hair, but I'm really enjoying everything else. Then you'll sit with the elbow on your hair, as opposed to having the whole thing in. So I think it's important to have that sort of middle ground.
Okay. And then you were talking about the dissociation and how important it is you said the top. Maybe we should define that top and bottom real quick. And then what that means to.
So the top is the person who's sort of doing the thing to the other person. And then if you're having a power exchange, then that person would be classified as the dominant. But sometimes somebody is both dominant and the bottom, in the sense, like, I can tell you, I need you to fuck me right now. Like, you would be both the dominant and the bottom.
Okay.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah,
so the bottom is the person that something is happening.
Receiving things.
Right.
Okay.
Right. So, but I think when you are in a dominant role, it's important to be responsible for the emotional well-being of the person who's in the submissive role, because they're not necessarily in a position to advocate for themselves right at that moment, because they're trying to let go of control. So you really have to sort of take care of them. And that's also the purpose of aftercare, which is basically at the end of a scene, like when you've been doing something that's sort of intense, to sort of take time to sort of hold the submissive and be with them as they sort of come down off of the high. Because I think one of the things that we don't entirely understand is the mental states that people go to when they're in either a submissive or a dominant role. Like, people can really experience very altered mental states. I mean, I think that's part of the fun, right?
I was going to say, isn't that part of, I would imagine that's a large part of the draw to BDSM in general, right? Is that altered state?
Right. And so I think that like aftercare is really about helping people sort of come back from that altered state and get back into their sort of regular way of functioning. Okay.
And that's just sort of a gentle, holding, quiet, easing back in experience usually? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm imagining, given that you're talking about altered states, you're talking about maybe dissociating, you're talking about experimentation in some ways, I'd imagine this gets much easier, or maybe I want to say much safer, when you know somebody well, when you've got a regular partner. Like this must be all a little bit, I don't quite want to say risky, but more challenging if you're dealing with somebody brand new.
Well, I think it actually can be challenging in different ways in different places, because I think when you're brand new, you tend to have a lot of really verbal discussions about what's going to happen very early, because you don't know this person and you want to like make sure nothing crazy happens. What you often see in longer term relationships is people are like, I know this person, I know it will happen. I don't have to check in with them because we know that this is a thing that works. And oftentimes you find that the really bad consent fuck ups actually happen later in relationships.
Oh, okay. Because you're sort of taking consent for granted or something, or you've got assumptions there. Okay.
Right. You think you know the person. And the thing is you really do need to keep checking in even after you've been known someone for quite some time.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it seems to me that it's a community that, done well, of course, is very consent oriented, and the rest of us could learn something from that.
I do think that they're very consent oriented, but I also think that we haven't done a good enough job of figuring out what to do when consent things get fucked up.
Okay.
Because I think a lot of us have been talking over the last, I would say, 5 years or so about doing restorative justice processes. So if somebody has a consent fuck up, like having a talk with them, so how they can avoid doing this in future. How can we avoid just trying to kick everybody who's fucked up out of the community, because then you kick out a lot of people. And a lot of times what happens with those people is they start their own communities where things become more fucked up.
Wow.
So, and I don't think we've done a good job of figuring out how to manage that at all. So,
yeah.
I think we definitely try, but I don't think that, I think sometimes people who are in the kink community will come off with this, we talk about consent so much more than you, so we're superior. We're not.
Okay. All right. So there's at least discussion about consent, but maybe it hasn't been implemented much better than anywhere else.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So where else can people go wrong with it, or where are there issues or problems with BDSM?
Well, I think people can go wrong with it. First of all, if you follow popular culture methods of how to do things, particularly if you read the 50 Shades books, which are completely about abuse and stalking, with masquerading as BDSM. If you use that as a model, you will fail.
Could you, as long as, probably so many people have read that, right? What's the difference between BDSM practiced well and what was in the book? If you could just give a few examples.
Well, so one of the major mistakes in the book is that it doesn't understand non-concordance. So I'm sure if you've been in the sexuality field for a while, you've read Emily Nagoski, and you understand that if something turns you on physically, if something makes you wet, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're emotionally turned on.
Okay, so that's the definition of non-concordance. Your body's not lining up with your mind.
Right.
Okay.
And so there's dialogue in that book that's like, well, you're wet, so you're clearly into this, so this is clearly okay. And I think that is a consent mistake that gets made all over the place all the time. Like, you have a hard on, you must be into this. And then rape of men can never happen, which clearly it does.
Right.
So I think we need to be really clear about just because your body is doing something doesn't mean your brain is into it. And we need to check in with using our words, or, something that is more that actually gets at whether people are okay or not.
Right. Right.
So what is your body saying? I think also that book has a lot of stalking in it. Yeah. Stalking is never okay. If somebody says no, don't hack their email. Right. Don't send somebody to follow them around. Don't send a helicopter to pick them up.
Not a problem most of us have. Yes, good to remember. Right.
There's a lot of I can buy a helicopter in that book. It's a total billionaire, which would be lovely if we were all billionaires. But no. Yeah. So I think those are some of the big mistakes that people can make is to pay attention to what popular culture says, and to think that you don't have to have the conversation. I think there's definitely this idea that if somebody's dressed a certain way, or if they if they're submissive, then they must be okay with something, and no, not necessarily with you.
Right. Yeah. And then I love what you pointed out before, that if you're in a relationship for a longer amount of time, you might start to take that consent for granted, that would be, a big problem.
Yeah, it is.
Okay. So what about people that maybe are intrigued by this and really haven't done it, and would where are the starting places? And let me ask that separately than the next question, because I think they're two different topics. So,
okay. So
how do people start?
Starting places, if you FetLife, find a Dungeon 101. Also, Dot Easton and Janet Hardy wrote these books, the Bottoming book and the Topping book.
Oh, okay.
And those books are really good for sort of a beginning, how do I do BDSM kind of stuff.
Okay.
So that's probably where I would start. They're short books. You can get through them in a day. They're very informative.
Okay. And then I guess, like you said, even regular sort of heterosexual sex has or could have a little bit of power play in it, or some...
It does, yeah.
Light bondage or something like that might be another way for people to use in and see what they think.
Right. But careful with your light bondage, because because you can use something that seems like it would be like fine, but if you know, people can get stuck and stuff. So make sure you have, like, if you're tying somebody up with silk scarves, make sure you have scissors around, preferably like banded scissors, so nobody would get hurt. Like if somebody's losing circulation, you have to get them out fast.
Okay.
You could also get like a good set of leather cuffs, probably at your local sex toy store or on Amazon, which has home sex toys too.
Right.
So,
right.
And I think cuffs are probably better and easier to get in and out of than just like, I'm going to use whatever's laying around, like a tie.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And then lastly, what about, you know, you've got one partner who is kinky or into BDSM and one who isn't. Like what do you recommend about those conversations and about how that might get solved with people?
Well, I mean, I think you have to look at like what works for those people. 'Cause I think, you know, Jack Moran said, if you go to war with your sexuality always wins. If you're a fundamentally kinky person and you're trying to not be kinky, it's probably not going to work.
Okay.
So I think you have to have really frank discussions about like, what can you tolerate? Like, is the kinky person going to be okay with just looking at porn about the kink and not actually acting on it? Mm-hmm. Is there a way for the non-kinky person to like be open to even trying things and seeing if they're comfortable or not? And then I guess the thing that I would probably think of that most other people would be like, how dare you suggest that? I would also talk about whether an open relationship makes sense. Because if there's something that you don't want to do with your partner that is really important to your partner's identity, I think there's a lot to be said for letting them do that with somebody else. So like, you know, if you don't want to do the thing, you shouldn't ever feel like you have to do the thing. Like if you really don't want to be tied up, particularly if it like makes you feel bad, like I think it would be better to let them go tie somebody else up than to feel like either they have to never tie somebody up for the rest of their life,
right,
or they have to betray you in some way, or like I feel like they're like it could be a reasonable alternative for something.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And I think if you're going to say I definitely never want you to do anything with anybody else, then I feel like you have more of an obligation to be open to trying things. I guess one of the things that I find makes me most nuts in my practice is people who are like, I don't want to have sex with you, but I don't want you to have sex with anybody else.
Right. Like people they didn't sign up for celibacy either, right? Like,
right. Yeah. This idea of like, you've chosen monogamy and therefore like, if you ever want to have sex again, you have to like leave the relationship. I just think that's sad.
Yeah. It's like taking all the options off the table. Yeah. So where can people find out more about you? And is there anything you want to share with the audience that you're promoting? Or
my website is tamarapincus.com. And I also have a book out called Polyamory, coming out about your non-monogamous relationships. So obviously not BDSM stuff,
right?
Polyamory stuff. But it's pretty helpful for people who are in the process of trying to come out as poly and need sort of resources around that. I do psychotherapy in DC, and I'm an AASECT certified sex therapist, and I also have 2 associates, so I have a whole band of open-minded people to help talk you through things if you need help with that.
Okay. I'll put all the links for that in the show notes too, so people can find you.
Okay, great.
Well, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
You're welcome. It was fun.
You've been listening to Better Sex. Please visit our website, bettersexpodcast.com, for show notes and additional episodes.
And that's a wrap for today. I really hope you enjoyed the episode. If you are enjoying the podcast, if some of this material resonates with you and you would like to make a difference and make sure that this keeps coming out in the world once a week, ongoing, there are a couple things you could do to show your appreciation. The first would be to go to iTunes and rate and review the show. That really helps us be found by new listeners when you review the show on iTunes. You can find a link at bettersexpodcast.com/iTunes. The other thing I want to invite you to consider is becoming a Patreon. For a small monthly pledge, you get some benefits. So for $2 a month, you get advance access to every single episode. For $5 a month, you get a chapter of my upcoming new book. And for $10 a month, I host quarterly get to know you and question and answer chats over the web, and you get invited to that. I would love to have your membership in that, become part of the Better Sex family. You can find a link at bettersexpodcast.com/Patreon, which is Patreon. Again, thanks for listening. I'm glad you're here. Feel free to comment, ask questions, get in touch. I'd love to hear from listeners. Thanks.